25-year-old prince, stood on the banks of the Euphrates in 605 BC, chest heaving, sword still gripped in his hand, the bodies of Egyptian soldiers stretching across the plain of Carchemish as far as the eye could see. Tens of thousands of men, the most feared army in the ancient world just hours before, now lay silent in the dirt. Pharaoh Necho II, the same ruler who had killed King Josiah of Judah, was already gone, fleeing south toward Egypt without a backward glance. And this young prince, blood-soaked and panting in the dust, had just redrawn the map of the ancient world. His name was Nebuchadnezzar, but here is what almost no one tells you about him. The man who destroyed Jerusalem, who reduced Solomon's temple to ash and marched God's people into exile in chains, this same man built the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. A city whose walls were so thick that chariots could race side by side along the top. A city with hanging gardens that seemed to defy gravity itself, with a sewage system so advanced that Europe wouldn't match it for another 2,000 years. So how is it possible that history's greatest builder is remembered almost exclusively as a destroyer? The answer is far more layered and far more fascinating than anything you've likely been told about him. If stories like this pull you in, the ones history buried or oversimplified, subscribing means you won't miss what's coming next. To truly understand Nebuchadnezzar, you have to understand the world that made him. And that means traveling back further than most people expect, to a time when Babylon was not the gleaming colossus of legend, but a broken, humiliated city ground beneath the heel of a far crueler power. When most people picture Babylon, they see the towering blue-glazed gates, the ziggurats clawing at the sky, the sheer, overwhelming scale of it. But that Babylon didn't simply exist. It had to be rebuilt from nothing, because for generations Babylon had been a city on a leash, dominated and degraded by the Assyrian Empire, the most ruthless military machine the ancient Middle East ever produced. In 689 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib finally lost patience with Babylonian resistance. What he did next shocked even his contemporaries. He didn't just conquer Babylon, he erased it. He demolished the temples, diverted the waters of the Euphrates to flood the rubble, and formally declared that the city would never rise again. The oldest sacred city in Mesopotamia, a place venerated across every culture in the region, was deliberately drowned in mud and silence. It was a statement of absolute dominance. It was also a catastrophic miscalculation, because empires, when they humiliate a people, tend to forget that humiliation has a very long memory. While Babylon lay buried, a family was waiting, a family that remembered everything. Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, had no royal blood, no inherited throne, no dynastic claim to anything. Cuneiform tablets that have survived more than 26 centuries describe him plainly as the son of a nobody, likely a commander from a Chaldean tribe in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia. And yet this man looked at the Assyrian Empire, the dominant superpower of his age, and decided he was going to pull it apart. In 626 BC, with Assyria tearing itself apart in civil war, Nabopolassar seized the throne of Babylon, but seizing it was the straightforward part. Assyria still commanded a vast army, still controlled territory stretching from Egypt to Persia, and it had absolutely no intention of surrendering its most prized possession without a war. What followed was 15 years of grinding, total conflict. Nabopolassar forged an alliance with the Medes from what is now Iran, and together they began closing the trap. In 614 BC, the Medes took Assur, the spiritual heart of Assyria. Then in 612 BC, the two allies turned toward Nineveh itself, the imperial capital, ringed by 12 kilometers of walls and moats that looked utterly impregnable. The siege lasted 3 months. Then, according to the Babylonian chronicles, a flood along the Tigris collapsed part of the walls, and Nabopolassar walked through the breach. Nineveh didn't just fall, it was obliterated. The prophet Nahum described it with a ferocity that still sends a chill through the reader thousands of years later. Woe to the bloody city. The walls of Babylon were so massive, so impossibly vast, that the ancient world simply ran out of language to describe them adequately. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before we can understand what Nebuchadnezzar built, we need to understand the man who built it and the world he inherited when he finally sat down on that throne. Consider what he had already accomplished before he was even crowned. At 25 years old, he had shattered the Egyptian army at Carchemish, pursued the survivors across hundreds of miles, and stripped Pharaoh Necho of every territorial gain he had made in the Levant. The entire corridor from the border of Egypt to the Euphrates River changed hands in a single season of fighting. 2 Kings records Egypt's humiliation with almost surgical brevity. The pharaoh never left his own land again. That one sentence carries the full weight of what Nebuchadnezzar had done. He hadn't just won a battle, he had permanently redrawn the map of the ancient world. And then, at the height of that triumph, with the dust of victory still settling, came the message from home. His father was dead, the throne was empty. Every hour he spent in the field was an hour someone else could use to claim Babylon. The decision he made in that moment tells you everything about the kind of king he would become. He didn't panic, and he didn't abandon his campaign carelessly. He transferred command of the army and custody of the prisoners to his generals with deliberate precision, then took a small escort and drove straight across the desert, the fastest, most punishing route back to Babylon. Weeks of hard riding through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the ancient world, and on the 7th of September, 605 BC, a date the Babylonian chronicles recorded with the confidence of people who knew history was being made, Nebuchadnezzar II took the throne. 43 years, that is how long he would reign. And in those 4 decades, he would do something that separates him from nearly every other conqueror in the ancient record. He would stop treating his empire as a machine for making war and start treating it as a canvas for making civilization. Most kings of the ancient world measured their greatness in territory. More land, more tribute, more enemies broken. Nebuchadnezzar certainly waged war, we'll get to that. But the defining obsession of his reign wasn't conquest, it was construction. The Babylon he inherited from Nabopolassar was already a city of consequence. His father had done meaningful work rebuilding it after generations of Assyrian suppression, when Nineveh had deliberately kept Babylon diminished, a reminder of who held power in the ancient Near East. But what Nabopolassar had started was, in retrospect, merely the foundation for what his son envisioned. Nebuchadnezzar didn't want a respectable capital. He wanted something that had never existed before. A city so magnificent, so overwhelming in scale and beauty, that anyone who entered it would understand immediately that they were standing at the center of the world. And remarkably, impossibly, he delivered exactly that. To understand what he built, you have to start where every conversation about Babylon must eventually start: the walls. Not because they were the most beautiful thing in the city or even the most famous, but because they established the terms of everything else. They announced, before a visitor had seen a single temple or palace or garden, that this place operated by different rules, that the people who built this were not thinking in ordinary human proportions. Herodotus visited Babylon around 450 BC, roughly a century and a half after Nebuchadnezzar had finished his great building projects. By then, the city had already passed through Persian hands. It had been conquered, reorganized, partially damaged. And yet, even in that diminished state, even seen through the eyes of a Greek traveler who had visited Egypt and Persia and the great cities of the Mediterranean world, Babylon stopped him cold. He wrote about the walls with the careful, almost reluctant precision of someone trying to be believed. He knew his readers would doubt him. He gave measurements anyway. The outer wall of Babylon, according to Herodotus, ran for roughly 56 miles around the city's perimeter. It was wide enough at the top that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on it without difficulty. The walls were built from baked brick set in bitumen, the same dark, tar-like substance that seeped naturally from the ground in that region, and they rose to a height that ancient sources describe in terms that modern archaeologists have spent generations trying to reconcile with the physical evidence. Towers rose above the wall at regular intervals. A deep moat ran along the outside. The whole system was not merely a defensive structure, it was a statement. It said, "Whatever you have seen before, you have not seen this." And the walls were only the beginning. Inside that perimeter, Nebuchadnezzar had spent decades layering wonder upon wonder, temples, processional roads, palaces, and the structures that would eventually pass into legend so completely that people would argue for centuries about whether they had ever existed at all. The city he built was real, the ambition behind it was almost mythological, and to understand how he paid for all of it, in treasure, in labor, and in human suffering, we have to follow him back to the west, and to a small kingdom called Judah. The outer walls of Babylon stretched nearly 90 kilometers in perimeter, according to Herodotus, though modern historians believe that figure was heavily exaggerated. The most widely accepted estimate places the inner walls at around 18 kilometers, which is already a staggering achievement. But length was never the most remarkable quality of these walls. Width was. At the top, the walls of Babylon measured approximately 26 meters across. Herodotus described a 4-horse chariot making a complete turn on the summit. 2 chariots could pass each other, traveling in opposite directions without either one slowing down. That detail alone should stop you cold. What most accounts leave out, however, is that the walls were not simply a thick barrier. They were a layered defensive system that no military force of the era could realistically breach. The outermost wall was constructed from fired mud brick. Behind it lay a compacted fill of rubble and earth. Behind that stood a second, even thicker inner wall, and fronting the entire structure was a deep moat drawing water directly from the Euphrates. Any invading army would first need to cross that moat, then assault the outer wall, traverse the earthen embankment, and finally face the inner wall, all while defenders rained down arrows, stones, and boiling oil from the wide platform above. In 600 BC, no force on earth possessed the means to crack that system, not one. If Nebuchadnezzar's military engineering is already striking you as remarkable, you should know that the walls were only the shell. What he constructed inside them would have made any arriving visitor genuinely question whether they had left the known world behind. The Euphrates River divided Babylon in two, and most ancient cities simply accepted such a division as a fact of geography. Nebuchadnezzar chose to bridge it. That sounds straightforward until you consider what it actually required. The Euphrates was wide, its current powerful, and its waters swelled dramatically during the spring floods. The Babylonian engineers responded with a solution that bordered on audacious. They temporarily diverted the river's course, sank stone pillars into the exposed riverbed, and then allowed the water to return around the completed foundations. The finished bridge stretched roughly 120 meters, with pillars spaced every 6 meters and a deck of cypress and cedar so thick it bore the full weight of loaded wagons. According to Herodotus, the wooden floorboards were lifted every night to prevent thieves from moving between the city's two halves under cover of darkness. But infrastructure, however impressive, was not what made Babylon visually unlike anything else on earth. Nebuchadnezzar ordered entire buildings faced in glazed brick, cobalt blue, golden yellow, brilliant white, Take a moment with that. In an age when virtually every city on the planet was composed of brown earth, grey stone and dust, Babylon announced itself in colors that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The Ishtar Gate, the great ceremonial entrance to the city, rose 14 meters high, taller than a 4-story building, and was covered in deep blue glazed brick with bulls and dragons molded in relief and finished in yellow and white. When sunlight struck that surface, the gate appeared to be carved from solid sapphire. A reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate stands today in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Even indoors, under artificial light, even knowing it is a modern reproduction, visitors consistently fall silent when they walk into that room. Now place yourself before the original, under the full Mesopotamian sun, as a procession of priests moves beneath it, drums beating, chants rising, incense smoke drifting across the avenue. The effect must have been genuinely overwhelming. That avenue, the processional way, ran more than 20 meters wide through the heart of the city. Its flanking walls were lined with the same blue glazed brick and decorated with 120 lions in relief, 60 on each side, each figure nearly 2 meters long, molded and glazed in yellow, brown and red. Picture arriving in Babylon for the first time, whether as a foreign dignitary, a merchant from the far edge of the known world, or a prisoner of war, and walking the length of that avenue with an endless corridor of silent roaring lions against that impossible blue. No words were necessary. The message was architectural. You have entered the center of the world. Conduct yourself accordingly. And then there is the detail that tends to genuinely surprise people. Babylon had a sewage system. In 600 BC, while much of the world would continue disposing of waste in the streets for the next 2,000 years, Nebuchadnezzar's engineers had already designed covered drainage channels running beneath the main avenues and emptying into the Euphrates downstream from the city. Storm drainage existed. Ceramic gutters connected individual homes to the main underground galleries. This was deliberate, planned sanitation infrastructure at a level Rome would only match centuries later, and that medieval Europe would essentially forget had ever been possible. Yet for all of this, what placed Babylon among the 7 wonders of the ancient world were the Hanging Gardens. And here the story takes an unexpectedly intimate turn, because tradition holds that Nebuchadnezzar did not build the gardens for prestige or propaganda. He built them for his wife. Her name was Amytis, a Median princess raised among the green, forested mountains of what is now northwestern Iran. When she came to Babylon, she found herself surrounded by flat, dry, brown plains extending to every horizon. No peaks, no forests, nothing of the landscape she had known since childhood. She grew homesick, and Nebuchadnezzar, the man who commanded the most powerful army on earth, who had broken Egypt and was already calculating the destruction of Jerusalem, looked at his wife's grief and decided to bring the mountains to her. The Hanging Gardens rose in tiered terraces, stacked one above the other, each level planted with trees, flowers, and vegetation gathered from across the empire. Ancient writers described the structure as an artificial green mountain rising from the Mesopotamian plain, visible for miles in every direction, defying everything that nature and contemporary engineering were supposed to allow. Water was drawn from the Euphrates and lifted to the uppermost terrace by a system of screws, almost certainly the same mechanism later credited to Archimedes, deployed here centuries before his time. From the top, water cascaded down through each successive level, irrigating the plantings and filling the desert air with the continuous sound of falling water. There is something almost tender about it, an all-conquering king engineering a mountain out of love. But do not let the romance soften the picture entirely. Nebuchadnezzar was, at his core, a predator. While he was planting gardens for Amytis, he was simultaneously mapping the destruction of every kingdom that stood in his path, including a small, proud nation in the hills of Judea that was about to make the most catastrophic diplomatic miscalculation of its entire history. What few people truly grasp about Nebuchadnezzar is that he didn't wake up one morning consumed by hatred for Jerusalem. He had no personal vendetta against the Jews, no particular grievance with Solomon's temple. The destruction of that city was not an act of passion. It was the final consequence of a long chain of catastrophic decisions, broken promises, and disastrously miscalculated political gambles. And almost every one of those decisions was made by the kings of Judah themselves. Nebuchadnezzar extended chances more than one, and every single one was squandered. But this part of the story, the part that actually explains how Jerusalem came to fall, is so layered, so packed with reversals and betrayals, that it demands to be told carefully. So that is precisely what we are going to do. To understand Jerusalem's fate, you first have to understand what Judah actually was in 605 BC. And the honest answer is that it was a kingdom in name only, a territory smaller than many American states, wedged between barren mountain ridges and the Negev desert, with a total population that may have barely reached 120 souls. Babylon, by comparison, was a city that dwarfed the entire kingdom. Jerusalem itself, the holy city, the seat of David's dynasty, the home of the temple, was smaller than a single district in the Babylonian capital. And this miniature kingdom sat in perhaps the worst piece of real estate in the ancient world, directly astride the land corridor connecting two colossal empires, Babylon to the north and east, Egypt to the southwest. Judah was the doormat between two slamming doors. When Nebuchadnezzar shattered Egypt at Carchemish, the shockwave arrived in Jerusalem almost instantly. The king on the throne at that moment was Jehoiachin, and the story of how he got there already tells you everything about Judah's condition. He wasn't chosen by the people. He wasn't anointed by a prophet. He was installed by Pharaoh Necho II, the same man who had killed the beloved King Josiah and then removed Josiah's son Jehoiachin, the king the people had actually wanted. Necho even stripped the man of his birth name, Eliakim, and replaced it with Jehoiakim, a small but unmistakable signal of who held the real power. He was an Egyptian puppet, plain and simple, and then, overnight, Egypt ceased to be a power worth serving. So Jehoiakim did the only thing available to him. He knelt before Nebuchadnezzar. As the Babylonian armies swept down through Syria and along the Mediterranean coast, gathering the submission of every king in their path, Jehoiakim opened his gates, paid his tribute, and swore his loyalty. 2 Kings 24 records it bluntly. In the year 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, arrived on Judah's doorstep, and Jehoiakim became his vassal. With that submission came the first wave of deportees marching out of Jerusalem toward Babylon. But this was no mass exile, not yet. What Nebuchadnezzar did was far more deliberate, far more surgical. He took the best. The book of Daniel opens precisely at this moment. Nebuchadnezzar's orders to his chief official were explicit. Bring young men from the Judean nobility, physically flawless, intelligent, well-educated, handsome, and capable of standing in the king's palace. This wasn't punishment, it was harvesting. The empire was plucking the brightest minds, the future leaders, the children of Jerusalem's elite, and transplanting them into Babylon to be re-educated, renamed and absorbed. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known by their Babylonian names, Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were among them. Teenagers, uprooted from everything they knew, facing a march of over 1,500 kilometers across the desert to be remade into Babylonians. Here is a detail that most people miss entirely when they read Daniel's story. He did not arrive in Babylon after Jerusalem fell. He arrived nearly 20 years before it. He watched the catastrophe unfold from a distance, receiving word of every catastrophic decision the kings of Judah made in the years that followed. and those decisions were spectacular in their foolishness. Jehoiakim, that opportunistic puppet who pledged loyalty to whoever held the most power, made perhaps the worst miscalculation of his reign. After 3 years of paying tribute to Babylon, he simply stopped. He turned his back on Nebuchadnezzar and rebelled because Egypt was whispering promises in his ear. The pharaoh offered military backing, protection, a coalition strong enough to push back against Babylon. It was a seductive lie, and Jehoiakim believed it. The prophet Jeremiah screamed warnings into the void. The entire 3/6 chapter of Jeremiah reads like a slow-motion tragedy. Jeremiah dictated his prophecies to his scribe Baruch, who committed them to a scroll. The scroll was read aloud in the temple. Palace officials heard it, were shaken to their core, and brought it before the king. It was winter. Jehoiakim sat in his private quarters with a fire burning in the brazier beside him. An official began reading the scroll aloud, and every 3 or 4 columns the king picked up a scribe's knife, sliced off the section that had just been read, and fed it to the flames. Cut and burn, until every word Jeremiah had spoken, every warning, every plea, every prophecy, curled into ash. The text notes with quiet devastation that Jehoiakim showed no fear and did not tear his garments, a detail that lands hard once you understand that tearing one's garments was the ancient gesture of grief, repentance, and moral horror. Jehoiakim felt nothing. He destroyed the word of God with the same casual indifference as someone discarding rubbish. Then he ordered Jeremiah and Baruch arrested. The two vanished. The biblical text says simply that the Lord hid them. Jeremiah had also delivered a personal prophecy against Jehoiakim, brutal and specific. He accused the king of building his palace through injustice and forced labor, of draping himself in cedar and vermilion while his kingdom rotted beneath him, and he told him plainly, "You will die with no one to mourn you. Your body will be dragged out and thrown beyond Jerusalem's gates like a discarded carcass." Nebuchadnezzar, for his part, did not respond to the rebellion immediately, and that restraint was itself a kind of cruelty. Rather than unleashing his full army at once, he sent raiding parties, Chaldeans, Arameans, Moabites, Ammonites, smaller forces designed to harass, to bleed, to terrify. It was a cat toying with a mouse. Nebuchadnezzar wanted Jehoiakim to cry out to Egypt for rescue, and then discover in his most desperate hour that Egypt would never come. Egypt never came. Of course it didn't. Necho's forces were still recovering from the catastrophe at Carchemish, and no Egyptian pharaoh was going to risk another army against the most powerful military machine in the ancient world just to rescue an insignificant vassal king tucked away in the Judean hills. So in 598 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's patience finally ran out. He assembled his main army and marched on Jerusalem himself. And here history takes one of its stranger turns. Jehoiakim died before the Babylonian army even arrived at the gates. How exactly he died, nobody can say with certainty. 2 Kings simply records that he slept with his fathers, the standard biblical phrase for a natural death. But Jeremiah had predicted something far less dignified, that Jehoiakim would receive the burial of a donkey, his body dragged out and thrown beyond the city walls. Some historians believe his own courtiers killed him in a last-minute desperate attempt to placate Nebuchadnezzar before the siege began. Others think disease simply took him at the worst possible moment. Whatever the cause, the throne dropped without warning into the hands of his son. Jehoiachin was 18 years old. He had been king for 3 months, and the most powerful army on earth was camped outside his walls. Consider the weight of that situation for a moment. This boy had not chosen rebellion. He had no time to govern, no time to build alliances, no time to learn what it even meant to be a king. He had inherited a suicidal war that his father started and didn't live long enough to finish. Now, at 18, Jehoiachin faced exactly two options. He could fight to the death and guarantee the total annihilation of Jerusalem, or he could surrender and hope that Nebuchadnezzar had some mercy left in him. Jehoiachin chose to surrender. 2 Kings describes the moment with quiet, devastating simplicity. Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his princes and his officers. He went out. That phrase is the whole story. He opened the gates and walked toward the enemy. Picture it, a royal teenager, almost certainly trembling, crossing the Kidron Valley toward Nebuchadnezzar's tents with his mother beside him and surrounded by the very officials who had counseled his father into this catastrophe and now had to face its consequences in person. Nebuchadnezzar accepted the surrender, but this time the price was dramatically higher than it had been in 605. This time he emptied Jerusalem. The Book of Kings catalogues what was taken, and every line reads like another blow. The treasures of the temple, the treasures of the royal palace, every gold vessel Solomon had commissioned for the sanctuary, lampstands, basins, sacred objects that had survived 4 centuries, cut into pieces, and then the human toll, recorded with almost clinical precision. 10,000 people deported, all the princes, all the warriors, all the blacksmiths and craftsmen. 2 Kings doesn't soften it. None remained save the poorest sort of the people of the land. 10,000 people in chains, marching 1,500 kilometers east through the desert toward Babylon. Men, women, children of Jerusalem's elite, walking away from everything they had ever known. Among them was Jehoiachin himself, the young king who surrendered to spare the city. He would spend the next 37 years imprisoned in Babylon. 37 years. He entered as a teenage king and emerged as a white-haired old man, released only after Nebuchadnezzar was already dead and a new Babylonian ruler decided to let him see sunlight again. And among those 10,000 marching east was the prophet Ezekiel, the man who would produce the strangest and most unsettling visions in all of the Old Testament. Wheels within wheels, dry bones rising from the dust, a temple that was never actually built. Ezekiel was pulled from Jerusalem in 597 BC and set down on the bank of the Chebar Canal in Babylon, where he saw in vision the glory of God departing from the temple before it had even been destroyed. He knew what was coming before anyone else did. And yet, despite stripping Jerusalem of its gold, its craftsmen, its soldiers, and its nobility, Nebuchadnezzar did not destroy the city. He didn't burn the temple. He didn't tear down the walls. Instead, he did something that reveals a remarkably cold imperial logic. He installed a puppet king, Jehoiachin's uncle, a man Nebuchadnezzar personally selected and renamed from Mattaniah to Zedekiah. The new name meant justice of the Lord, which was a bitter irony given what this man would eventually do. Zedekiah was 21 when he received the throne, though received is far too generous a word. He didn't inherit a kingdom, he inherited a skeleton. The treasury was bare, the temple stripped of everything that glittered, the best warriors and craftsmen gone, the royal court hollowed out. Zedekiah ruled over a city of the poor and a countryside of widows, and yet, staring at those empty storerooms and gutted walls, he somehow managed to repeat the exact same mistake his brother Jehoiakim had made. He rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, and this time there would be no mercy at all. But before we follow that rebellion to its terrible conclusion, and the destruction of Jerusalem is, without exaggeration, one of the most harrowing scenes in the entire Bible, we need to pause and look at the other side of this story. Because while Judah was bleeding, while Jerusalem was being stripped layer by layer like an onion, something unexpected was unfolding inside Babylon itself. The exiles were not rotting in dungeons, They were living, and this is where Nebuchadnezzar becomes far more complicated than any simple story of villain and victim allows. In 1893, German excavators working on the outskirts of Babylon uncovered an archive of more than 300 cuneiform tablets, now known as the Babylonian ration texts. These were administrative records, bureaucratic lists of food distributed by the government to various groups living in the city. And among the names inscribed on those tablets, archaeologists found one that stopped them cold: Jehoiachin, king of the land of Yahudu; Jehoiachin, king of Judah. There he was, the exiled king, documented in Nebuchadnezzar's own administrative records, receiving regular allocations of oil and grain from the Babylonian state. It wasn't a dungeon. It was something closer to a gilded captivity, a prison that at least remembered to feed you. And Jehoiachin wasn't alone. The tablets mention sons of the king of Judah, Jewish craftsmen, and dozens of other deportees from across the empire, all drawing government rations. Does this rewrite the story? Not entirely. Forced deportation is still forced deportation, tearing people from their land, their temples, their ancestral graves. That doesn't become humane simply because the captor provides a food allowance. But it does reveal that Nebuchadnezzar was not the irrational monster of popular imagination. He operated with a system. The deportees were an investment. Craftsmen built his monuments. Intellectuals staffed his administration. Young nobles were re-educated to serve the empire's interests. It was cruelty, yes, but cruelty in service of a purpose, not cruelty for its own pleasure. Psalm 137 captures the anguish of these exiles with a raw honesty that still cuts through the centuries. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows. The Babylonian guards asked the Jewish exiles to sing the songs of Zion, perhaps for entertainment, perhaps out of genuine curiosity. And the exiles answered with a question that has never really stopped echoing: how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? But while the exiles wept beside Babylonian canals, back in Jerusalem Zedekiah was engineering the final catastrophe. And the tragedy of Zedekiah is that he was not an evil man, he was a weak one. Jeremiah 38 makes this painfully clear. Zedekiah would summon Jeremiah in secret, hiding the meetings from his own officials, and ask in a hushed voice whether there was any word from God. He genuinely wanted to hear it. He genuinely wanted to do what was right. He simply lacked the backbone to follow through. Jeremiah's message could not have been clearer. Surrender to Nebuchadnezzar, and you will live. Your family will survive. The city will not burn. Resist, and everything dies. No coded language, no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. Surrender and live. Resist and die. But Zedekiah's officials, the nobles left behind after Nebuchadnezzar had taken the best of Jerusalem, pushed relentlessly in the other direction. They looked south toward Egypt and saw salvation. The new pharaoh, Epres, was promising troops. Envoys traveled back and forth between Jerusalem and the Nile Delta, and slowly, methodically, Zedekiah was pulled into rebellion. In the 9th year of his reign, 588 BC, he stopped paying tribute to Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar, for the third and final time, turned his army toward Jerusalem. Only this time was different. He didn't come to loot. He didn't come to deport. He didn't come to install another compliant puppet on the throne. This time, Nebuchadnezzar came to erase Jerusalem entirely. What followed over the next 18 months is one of the most terrible stories the ancient world ever produced. A siege so prolonged, so suffocating, so absolute, that the people trapped inside those walls were driven to places no human being should ever have to go. The siege, the famine, the fall, the fire, the temple collapsing in flames, every detail of it matters. January 588 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's army surrounded Jerusalem, and not in any casual sense of the word. The Babylonians constructed siege ramps, assault towers, and an entire wall encircling the city from the outside, a wall around the walls. The Hebrew word for it is *DK*, a physical barrier designed to seal the city completely. No food entered, no water entered, no messenger slipped out. Jerusalem became a closed container with tens of thousands of human beings trapped inside, and all Nebuchadnezzar had to do was let time do its work. He was patient in the way a vulture is patient. He had no need to batter down the gates when starvation would open them for him, and the starvation came slowly, as it always does, stripping away the layers of civilization one by one. First the luxuries disappeared, then the grain, then the livestock, then things no human being should ever contemplate eating. The Book of Lamentations, attributed to Jeremiah, the very man who had spent decades warning this would happen, describes the famine with a precision that lodges in your throat. Children's tongues sticking to the roof of their mouths from thirst, young children begging for bread with no one to break it for them, faces blackened like coal, skin shrunk tight against the bones until people were unrecognizable in the streets. And then comes the verse that no one reads aloud without pausing. Mothers boiling and eating their own children. Jeremiah wasn't reaching for dramatic effect. Deuteronomy 28, written centuries before any of this, had already prophesied in horrifying specificity that this exact thing would happen if Israel abandoned its covenant. Moses had described it. Jeremiah was now documenting it. This was not poetry. It was a report from inside a dying city. And then, in the middle of all of it, something happened that nearly changed everything. The Egyptian army appeared on the horizon. Pharaoh Apries, who had made promises of military support, finally sent troops marching north. When Babylonian scouts spotted the dust cloud rising from the coastal plain, Nebuchadnezzar made a calculated decision. He temporarily lifted the siege. He pulled his forces away from Jerusalem's walls and moved to intercept the Egyptians before they could close the distance. And inside the city, for one brief, gasping moment, people breathed again. The gates opened, food came in. The officials who had pushed Zedekiah into rebellion pointed at the retreating Babylonian army and said they had been right all along. Egypt had come. Babylon had flinched. Jeremiah was not impressed. His message to Zedekiah was immediate and unambiguous. Pharaoh's army would return to Egypt, the Babylonians would come back, and the city would burn. He went further, into territory that bordered on the absurd in its certainty. Even if every single Babylonian soldier were wounded, they would drag themselves from their tents and set Jerusalem on fire. That was the level of inevitability he was describing, and he was right. The confrontation with Egypt lasted days, perhaps weeks, but the outcome was exactly what Nebuchadnezzar had calculated and Jeremiah had foreseen. The Egyptian commanders looked at the Babylonian formations, made their assessment, and turned around. No great battle, no heroic stand. Apries simply retreated behind the Sinai and vanished, leaving Jerusalem utterly alone. Nebuchadnezzar's army rebuilt the ramps, resealed the siege wall, and tightened the grip. What happened to Jeremiah during this brief interval is worth telling in full, because it reveals the particular madness that had taken hold of Jerusalem in its final days. When the siege temporarily lifted, Jeremiah attempted to leave the city to attend to a land matter in the territory of Benjamin. A guard at the city gate arrested him on the spot, accusing him of defecting to the Babylonians. Jeremiah denied it. He was beaten anyway and thrown into a cistern converted into a prison in the house of an official named Jonathan, where he remained for days, possibly weeks. Zedekiah summoned him in secret, always in secret, because the king was terrified of his own officials, and asked whether there was any word from God. Jeremiah, beaten and imprisoned, gave the same answer he had always given: "You will be handed over to the king of Babylon." Zedekiah at least had the decency not to send him back to Jonathan's dungeon, transferring him instead to the court of the guard. Still a prisoner, but in open air, and from there, Jeremiah kept preaching: "Surrender and live, stay and die by sword, famine or plague." The military officials had heard enough. To them, Jeremiah was a traitor, a Babylonian sympathizer corroding the will to resist. So they took him and dropped him into a muddy cistern belonging to a man named Malchiah. No water, only thick mire, and left him there to sink. An elderly man who had spent his entire life warning that this moment was coming, buried to his waist in filth at the bottom of a dark hole, waiting to die of hunger in a city already dying of hunger. He would have died there, but an Ethiopian official in the royal palace, a man named Ebed-Melech, a foreigner, an African in the court of Judah, went directly to the king and said plainly that these men had done evil to Jeremiah, and that the prophet would die where he was. Zedekiah, the king who could never quite commit to anything, gave the order: "Take 30 men and pull him out before he dies." Ebed-Melech went down into that hole with ropes and old rags. The text is specific about the rags, so the ropes wouldn't cut into Jeremiah's armpits, and hauled the prophet out of the mud. While the city starved and the walls shook under Babylonian battering rams, a man whose name history barely preserved saved Israel's most unpopular prophet with 30 men and a handful of worn cloth. It is one of the quietest acts of courage in the entire story. Jeremiah survived. He would outlast the siege, outlast the destruction, outlast the city itself. Living long enough to sit among the smoking ruins of everything he had warned would fall, and write Lamentations, the most grief-saturated poem in the Hebrew language. The siege lasted 18 months. On the 9th day of the 4th month of Zedekiah's 11th year, July 586 BC, the walls broke. The earthen ramps the Babylonians had spent months constructing finally reached their height. The battering rams found their breach, and Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers poured through the northern wall near the middle gate, spreading through the city the way water moves through a rupture, fast, total, unstoppable. The Jewish soldiers fled by night through a gate between two walls near the king's garden, slipping out the back while the Babylonians entered through the front. And Zedekiah went with them, the king who had sworn to fight, who had rejected every warning, who had listened to officials promising Egyptian salvation, abandoned the civilian population of Jerusalem to face the most powerful army in the ancient world, and ran for the Jordan Valley, probably hoping to cross the river and disappear into Transjordan. He was running through the same plains where Joshua had once entered the promised land with trumpets and the Ark of the Covenant. The Babylonian cavalry caught him on the plains of Jericho. His soldiers scattered. He was taken alone. They brought him to Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah in Syria. And what happened next is difficult to read without looking away. Nebuchadnezzar pronounced his judgment, and the sentence was designed not to kill Zedekiah quickly, but to destroy him completely. They brought out his sons, one by one, and executed them in front of him. He was made to watch. He was made to see. After the last image burned into Zedekiah's eyes, the blood of his sons soaking into the hard-packed earth at Riblah, the Babylonians put out those eyes forever. They blinded him. The final thing this king would ever see was the death of his own lineage. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't simply punishing a rebellious vassal. He was constructing a monument of horror inside the mind of every subject ruler across the ancient Near East. The message needed no translation. This is what defiance costs. They bound Zedekiah in bronze chains and carried him to Babylon, where he died in prison, blind, childless, throneless, stripped of everything. A month after the walls were breached, Nebuzaradan arrived in Jerusalem. He was the captain of Nebuchadnezzar's personal guard, the commander dispatched to carry out the final sentence, and what he did was systematic, methodical, and total. He burned the temple of the Lord, he burned the royal palace, he burned every great house in the city. The text is deliberate about that phrase, every great man's house. This was not the chaos of looting soldiers, it was directed demolition, a calculated erasure of the structures that gave Jerusalem its power, its identity, its reason to exist. Solomon's temple, the house that had taken 7 years to build, constructed with stones cut at the quarry so no hammer would ring out on the sacred site, was reduced to ash. This was the place where the Ark of the Covenant had rested, where the glory of God had descended like a cloud on the day of its dedication 4 centuries before. The great bronze pillars named Jachin and Boaz, each standing nearly 8 meters tall and almost 2 meters across, were broken into pieces and hauled away. The 10 bronze stands, the massive bronze sea, that enormous basin resting on the backs of 12 cast bulls in the temple courtyard, all of it was shattered and carried off to Babylon. 2 Kings chapter 25 spends entire verses cataloguing every piece, every shovel, every snuffer, every basin. The author cannot stop listing what was lost. The inventory itself becomes a form of grief. Then came the people. Nebuzaradan arrested the high priest Serah and the second priest Zephaniah. He arrested the 3 keepers of the temple threshold, the military official commanding the men of war, 5 royal advisors found hiding inside the city, the army commander's scribe, and 60 common men. He brought them all before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah, and Nebuchadnezzar executed every one of them. The text records it without ceremony. The king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. Then comes the final sentence of 2 Kings, and it lands like a tombstone dropped into silence. So Judah was carried away out of their land. Not a metaphor, a fact. The kingdom that David had founded, that Solomon had covered in gold, that had outlasted Assyrian invasions, civil wars, and generations of both righteous and ruinous kings. This kingdom ceased to exist in the summer of 586 BC. 3 invasions, 3 deposed kings, 3 deportations spanning 2 decades, and now, in 586 BCE, it was finally over. The walls of Jerusalem lay in rubble, the temple reduced to a rectangle of ash, and the throne of David stood empty. Along the dusty roads leading east toward Babylon, a long column of deportees shuffled forward, leaving behind a silence so profound that Jeremiah reached for the image of a widow to describe it. How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How is she become as a widow, she that was great among the nations? Nebuchadnezzar had finished with Judah at last. But here is the question that almost never gets asked, and that reframes everything once you sit with it. Why did it take him so long? Any other conqueror of the ancient world would have leveled Jerusalem at the first sign of rebellion. The Assyrians certainly would have. Sargon II destroyed Samaria in 722 BCE, deported the entire kingdom of Israel, and those 10 tribes never found their way home. Nebuchadnezzar, by contrast, gave Judah 20 years and 3 separate chances to get it right. Each invasion came with progressively less patience, each deportation carried a sharper warning, and still he held back from the final blow longer than almost any emperor of his era would have. The simplest explanation is probably the truest one. Judah wasn't worth destroying. A compliant vassal state sitting between Babylon and Egypt was far more valuable intact than it was in ruins. Nebuchadnezzar only reached for annihilation when the cost of tolerance finally outweighed the cost of elimination. This wasn't fury, it was imperial arithmetic. And with the Levant now firmly under his control, Nebuchadnezzar could turn his attention to what he actually cared about most. Because war was only half of this man's story, perhaps not even half. He didn't want posterity to remember him as a destroyer. He wanted to be remembered as a builder, and what he constructed inside the walls of Babylon would make the fall of Jerusalem look like a minor historical footnote. The city of Babylon already carried enormous weight in the ancient world before Nebuchadnezzar ever touched it. But the Babylon his father Nabopolassar left him in 605 was merely the foundation of something far more extraordinary. What Nebuchadnezzar saw when he looked at Babylon was not a city, it was a canvas. He saw potential where others saw rubble, a floor plan for something the world had never encountered and may never encounter again. Over the 43 years of his reign, he transformed that canvas into the largest city on the face of the earth. And that is not narrator enthusiasm or ancient boasting, it is the consensus of modern archaeology. Between approximately 600 and 560 BC, Babylon was the most populous, most expansive, and most visually overwhelming city in existence. Nothing else came close. To understand what Nebuchadnezzar built, you have to start where every visitor started, at the walls. Babylon's defensive system was not a wall, it was a layered fortress that surrounded nearly 9 square kilometers of urban space. The outer wall, called Imgur Enlil, ran 7 meters thick. The inner wall, Naimeti Enlil, was nearly 8. Between them stretched a gap that could be packed with earth to form an elevated combat platform, and every 20 meters or so, watchtowers punched outward from the face of the walls. Herodotus, who visited Babylon roughly a century after Nebuchadnezzar, wrote that the top of the wall was wide enough for 2 4-horse chariots to pass each other side by side. Modern historians suspect he embellished slightly, he probably did. But Robert Koldewy's excavations in the early 20th century confirmed the essential truth. The walls were real, they were massive, and they were built from baked brick bonded with bitumen, the natural asphalt that seeped from the Mesopotamian soil and gave Babylonian construction a durability the ancient world simply could not replicate. But the walls were only the frame. What lived inside them was the point. And the first thing that struck any visitor entering the city was the processional way, the great central avenue that cut through Babylon from north to south like an artery of stone and color. It stretched more than 20 meters wide. Its pavement was laid in white and red limestone slabs, and beneath each slab, invisible to every foot that ever crossed it, Nebuchadnezzar had inscribed a personal dedication, words meant not for human eyes, but for the gods looking upward from below. The walls flanking the avenue were coated in deep glazed brick, lapis lazuli blue, the color of the desert sky at noon, and from that blue surface lions emerged in relief. 120 lions in total, 60 on each side, each more than 2 meters long, glazed in yellow, white and ochre, every one of them marching in the same direction, south, toward the heart of the city, as if escorting whoever walked that avenue into the presence of the divine. Each lion was the symbol of Ishtar, goddess of war and love, and together they transformed a street into a procession. At the avenue's northern end stood the Ishtar Gate. If you have never seen it, find a photograph. Better yet, go to Berlin. Go to the Pergamon Museum, because that is where it lives now. Koldewy unearthed its fragments between 1902 and 1914, and the museum painstakingly reassembled the gate to its full height of 14 meters. It is blue, entirely, overwhelmingly blue, glazed cobalt that catches light as though it were fired yesterday. And across that blue surface, in alternating rows, march bulls and dragons, the bulls of Adad, god of storms, and the Mushushu, the dragon serpents of Marduk, supreme deity of Babylon. 575 animals in total, each molded in relief, each enameled in white and yellow that blazes against the blue like stars against a night sky. Even reconstructed, fragmented, reassembled from thousands of shards, that gate stops you cold. Now imagine it whole and new, glistening under the Mesopotamian sun. incense drifting from the temples behind it, the sound of ceremonial drums rolling down the avenue toward you. Imagine arriving at that gate as a foreign ambassador, a vassal king, a prisoner of war. The message required no translation. You are small. This is not. If that image just landed the way it should, a like on this video is the simplest way to pass it on to someone else who needs to see it. Beyond the gate, Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the Exile, the great temple of Marduk, and the Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Babylon. And here we need to pause, because the Etemenanki is almost certainly the most famous building that most people don't realize actually existed. Its Sumerian name means the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It was a stepped pyramid, an artificial mountain of brick rising from the flattest alluvial plain in the world, and it stood at the center of Babylon's sacred precinct just west of the Exile. Nebuchadnezzar was not its original architect. The structure had been attempted, destroyed, and rebuilt across centuries, perhaps millennia, but he rebuilt it at the ultimate scale. A cuneiform tablet, known as the Exile tablet, gives the dimensions. The base measured 91 meters on each side, and the total height, by scholarly estimate, matched that base, 91 meters straight up. A geometric tower rising from a horizon so flat that the eye can travel dozens of kilometers in any direction without interruption. Travelers approaching Babylon would see the Etemenanki long before they saw anything else, a dark geometric shadow growing on the horizon with every step, until the scale finally registered and the mind struggled to accept that human hands had stacked it there. And if you are already thinking what most people think when they hear this, you are probably right. Genesis chapter 11 describes a tower whose top would reach the heavens, built in the land of Shinar, the biblical name for Mesopotamia. Most scholars agree the story of the Tower of Babel draws directly from the Mesopotamian ziggurat tradition, and the Etemenanki is the most compelling candidate. The name Babel is simply the Hebrew rendering of Bab-Elim, Gate of the Gods, which is the name of Babylon itself. The connection is not a fringe theory or a subtle implication. The biblical text is looking directly at this city and this tower and delivering a verdict on the ambition they represent. Nebuchadnezzar, when he restored the Etemenanki, left inscriptions declaring that he raised its top so that it might compete with the heavens. The language is almost identical to Genesis. The arrogance is identical. And the question the text raises, what does God think of that, hangs in the air over everything Nebuchadnezzar built. And so Nebuchadnezzar looked out over his city and saw something no other king in the ancient world could claim, a metropolis built not merely to house a population, but to announce a theology. The ziggurat of Etemenanki clawed toward the sky, and the author of Genesis, possibly writing or editing during the Babylonian exile while living in the literal shadow of that tower, looked up and saw exactly what Nebuchadnezzar intended every visitor to see, the power of Babylon made physical in brick and bitumen, rising toward the gods themselves. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't build only for the divine, he built for himself. The palace complex he raised in the northwest corner of the inner city was a structure of almost obscene scale. Archaeologist Robert Calderway identified 5 main courtyards connected by corridors and audience halls, the largest of which, the throne room, stretched 52 meters long and 17 meters wide. Its outer walls were decorated with the same blue-glazed brickwork as the Ishtar Gate, adorned with stylized palm trees and floral motifs in yellow and white. The room where Nebuchadnezzar received ambassadors, tributaries, and defeated kings was itself a declaration of cosmic order. You are entering the center of the world, and the man seated before you is not a man like other men. He is the chosen of Marduk. He is the son of Babylon. Bow down. And then there are the hanging gardens, and here the story becomes genuinely complicated. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one that has never been located with any certainty. Greek and Roman authors described them in dazzling detail. Strabo wrote of elevated terraces supported by arches and columns, irrigated by Archimedean screws that lifted water from the Euphrates to the summit. Diodorus Siculus described enormous trees planted on platforms 20 meters high, creating the illusion of a green mountain rising from the flat Mesopotamian plain. The most enduring legend, recorded by Berosus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek during the 3rd century BC, held that Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens for his wife Amytis, a Median princess who grew despondent in the dusty flatlands of Mesopotamia and longed for the green mountains of her homeland. It is a beautiful story, a romantic story, the kind that lodges itself in memory and refuses to leave. The problem is that not a single Babylonian inscription mentions the gardens. Nebuchadnezzar left dozens of texts describing his construction projects in exhaustive detail, every temple restored, every wall reinforced, every canal dug. He catalogued everything, except the gardens. Coldaway, after 18 years of excavation at Babylon, identified a structure with 14 vaulted rooms and a well that might have functioned as a hydraulic system, and proposed it as the garden's location. Most modern archaeologists remain unconvinced. Then, in 2013, Assyriologist Stephanie Daly published a compelling argument that the Hanging Gardens did exist, just not in Babylon. According to Daly, they were built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib in Nineveh, more than a century before Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Assyrian inscriptions describe an elevated garden with a sophisticated water-lifting system, and Nineveh, unlike Babylon, sat in a landscape with sufficient elevation and river access to support such an engineering feat. The confusion, Daly argues, arose because later Greek writers routinely conflated Nineveh with Babylon. Both were legendary Mesopotamian capitals, and when Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC, its fame was gradually absorbed into Babylon's growing mythology. If Daly is right, and many scholars find the argument persuasive, then the Hanging Gardens represent the greatest misattribution in the history of architecture. The man who obliterated the Assyrian legacy ended up inheriting even the wonder they created. The irony is almost poetic. But even stripped of the gardens, what Nebuchadnezzar built is staggering, because he didn't simply build in Babylon. He built Babylon. He restored the temple of Shamash in Sippar, the temple of Nabu in Borsippa, the temple of Sin in Ur, that same Ur from which Abraham had departed 1,000 years before. He excavated canals, reinforced dikes along the Euphrates to tame the floods that could erase an entire harvest in days, and constructed a massive defensive wall north of the city, the so-called Median Wall, stretching between the Euphrates and the Tigris to seal Babylon against invasion from the north. Every project carried an inscription. Every inscription opened the same way: I, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the faithful shepherd, the eternal chosen of Marduk. And then the list, brick by brick, canal by canal, temple by temple. The sheer volume of construction is almost impossible to comprehend for an era without machines, without steel, without reinforced concrete. Millions of bricks, each one shaped by hand, dried in the sun or fired in a kiln, carried on human backs to the precise location where it would be laid. And here is the detail that reveals more about Nebuchadnezzar than any battle or siege ever could. On many of the bricks of Babylon, thousands of them, perhaps millions, an inscription was stamped into the wet clay before firing: Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, provider of the Esagila and the Azida, firstborn son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon. Every single brick. You can walk into the Louvre, the British Museum, or the Metropolitan today and hold in your hands a brick 2,600 years old with his name pressed into the clay. He literally wrote himself into the atoms of the city. Every wall, Every pavement trodden by priests and slaves and merchants and soldiers carried those words. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't building a city, he was building his own immortality. And it worked, because 2,600 years later, we are still here, talking about him, reading his name. But while Nebuchadnezzar was stamping his identity into every brick, something was unfolding on the banks of Babylon's canals that he almost certainly never noticed. Something quiet, something that no army could suppress, no wall could contain, and no royal inscription could record. Because in the settlements where the Jewish deportees had been placed, along the Shabar Canal, in the communities taking root in Mesopotamian soil, a transformation was underway. The exiled Jews were doing something that no other deported people in the ancient world had ever managed. They were refusing to disappear. To understand what that means, you first need to understand what deportation normally meant in the ancient world. It was not simply a punishment. What made the Jewish exile different from every other deportation in the ancient world wasn't geography or politics or even sheer stubbornness. It was something far more unexpected, something the Assyrians, for all their centuries of calculated cruelty, had never encountered before and didn't know how to account for. The Assyrians had perfected demographic engineering into something almost scientific. Uproot a people, scatter them among strangers, and within 2 or 3 generations the original identity dissolved as completely as salt disappearing into water. Language went first, then religion, then memory, then everything else. It worked on the Arameans deported to Media. It worked on the Elamites redistributed across Assyria. Most famously, it worked on the 10 northern tribes of Israel carried off by Sargon II in 722 BCE, a people who vanished so thoroughly that 27 centuries of searching have never recovered them. Deportation was, in practice, a slow-motion genocide. No massacres, no dramatic violence, just dilution, just forgetting, just time doing its quiet, devastating work. But the Jews of Babylon didn't dilute, and the question that has fascinated historians ever since is a simple one. Why? The answer, when you find it, is almost disarmingly straightforward. They had something no other deported people possessed. They had a book, or rather, the fragments of what would eventually become one. When the exiles arrived in Babylon, they carried with them scrolls of parchment and papyrus, sacred texts, primitive versions of what we now call the Torah, collections of psalms, prophetic oracles, genealogical records, historical narratives. These were writings accumulated over centuries by priests and scribes and prophets in Jerusalem. And those texts possessed a power that no wall, no temple, no throne had ever managed to hold. They were portable. You could lose the land, you could lose the temple, the king, the army, the political independence, every physical anchor of national life. But you could not lose the words, not as long as someone knew how to read them, copy them, and pass them to their children. And that is precisely what the exiles did. For many scholars, the Babylonian exile stands as the single most important moment in the entire history of Judaism. More important than Moses at Sinai, more important than David in Jerusalem, more important than almost anything before or after. Because it was here in captivity that Judaism stopped being the religion of a place and became the religion of a text. Before the deportation, Israelite faith was anchored in concrete, physical things: Solomon's temple, the altar of sacrifice, the Ark of the Covenant, the city of Jerusalem, the promised land itself. Strip those things away, and the religion should have died. It should have become an archaeological footnote, like the faiths of the Moabites or the Ammonites, neighboring peoples of Judah who were also deported and also disappeared without a trace. Instead, the Jews in Babylon did something no other ancient people had ever done. They reinvented their religion to function without a temple, without an altar, without land, without a king. Animal sacrifice became prayer. The pilgrimage to the temple became the study of scripture. Territorial identity became textual identity. You weren't Jewish because you lived in Judah. You were Jewish because you kept the Sabbath, circumcised your sons, and knew the stories of the patriarchs by heart. And the prophets of the exile gave voice to this transformation with a literary power the ancient world rarely equaled. Chief among them was Ezekiel, a priest from the Jerusalem temple, deported in the second wave of 597 BCE alongside King Jehoiachin, settled among the exiles at Tel Aviv on the banks of an irrigation canal drawn from the Euphrates, 1,500 kilometers from everything he had ever known. And there, on that flat and foreign ground, Ezekiel began to have visions. Visions that defy language, 2,500 years of interpretation, and scholars still cannot fully decode what Ezekiel saw. The book opens with one of the strangest passages in all of Scripture, a whirlwind sweeping in from the north, a massive cloud with fire folding in on itself. And inside that fire, 4 living creatures, each bearing 4 faces, a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, 4 wings apiece, feet like the sole of a calf's foot, gleaming like burnished brass. Beside them, wheels within wheels, covered in eyes, moving in every direction without ever needing to turn. Above the creatures, a sapphire throne, and on that throne, a figure with the appearance of a man, glowing like molten metal from the waist up, like fire from the waist down, wrapped in a halo of rainbow light. Ezekiel saw all of this and fell flat on his face. Then a voice spoke, "Son of man, I send thee to the children of Israel." Scholars have wrestled with the meaning of that vision for millennia, but one thing emerges unmistakably from its context. Ezekiel was making a declaration. God had not remained behind in Jerusalem. He was not tethered to the temple, not confined within the borders of Judah, not some local deity who lost his power the moment his people were dragged away in chains. He was here, on the banks of an irrigation canal, in the flat heart of Mesopotamia, in the very shadow of the empire that had burned his house to the ground, and his glory was so overwhelming, so utterly beyond human categories, that language itself buckled under the weight of describing it. Wheels covered in eyes, faces pointing in every direction, fire that does not consume. This was not a vision, it was a theological argument dressed in the imagery of a fever dream. The God of Israel was not defeated, he was not captured, he did not flee, he came along. And if he could be present in Babylon, in the capital of the greatest empire on earth, then he was greater than that empire, greater than any temple built by human hands, greater than any god the Babylonians could lock inside a statue of gold. Then comes the Valley of Dry Bones, chapter 37 of Ezekiel. Possibly the most viscerally powerful image in all prophetic literature. In a vision, God carries Ezekiel to a valley blanketed with human bones, ancient, bleached white, scattered like the wreckage of an army that had been annihilated and left to rot under an open sky. God turns to Ezekiel and asks a question that hangs in the air like a challenge. "Son of man, can these bones live?" And Ezekiel gives the only honest answer available to him. "O Lord God, thou knowest." God then commands him to prophesy over the bones. As he speaks, something impossible begins to happen. Bone finds bone, sinew stretches over joint, flesh covers sinew, skin closes over flesh. The bodies assemble themselves and rise, but they are still, breathless, like an army of standing corpses. Then God tells Ezekiel to prophesy to the wind itself, and breath rushes in, and they live, and they stand upright, an exceeding great army. God's explanation is direct. These bones are the whole house of Israel. They say their hope is lost, that they are cut off completely, but God will open their graves. He will bring them back to their land. "This is not finished." Consider what those words meant to someone sitting in exile on the banks of a foreign river. His city was ash. His temple was rubble. His king sat in a Babylonian prison. Everyone he had known was dead, scattered, or enslaved. He was, in every meaningful sense, a dry bone lying in that valley. And the prophet looks at him and says, "You will live again." The story has not ended. This is not the last page. That promise, irrational, stubborn, insisting on a future when every visible piece of evidence argued against one, is what held Judaism together through the exile. It was not comfortable faith, the kind practiced in a sunlit temple on an ordinary morning. It was desperate faith, the faith of a man staring at a field of bones and choosing, against all reason, to believe in resurrection. And while Ezekiel prophesied in the south of Mesopotamia, another Jew was living an entirely different story, not beside irrigation canals, but inside Nebuchadnezzar's palace itself. His name was Daniel, and the book that bears his name is among the most contested texts in the entire Bible. Most critical scholars date the final composition of the book to the 2nd century BC, during the persecution of Antiochus IV, nearly 400 years after Nebuchadnezzar himself. But that distance doesn't erase the older traditions embedded within it, the real memories of exile, the echoes of lives actually lived inside the Babylonian court, and even approached purely as literature, as historical fiction, as parable, as allegory. What the text says about Nebuchadnezzar is remarkable, because the Nebuchadnezzar of Daniel is not a villain. He is not the bloodthirsty monster you might expect to find in a book written by the descendants of people he forcibly uprooted and deported. Instead, he emerges as something far more unsettling, a man of enormous power and genuine arrogance, capable of both cruelty and generosity, haunted by dreams he cannot decipher, surrounded by advisors he cannot trust, and confronted again and again by a God who towers above everything he has ever built. Consider the famous story of the fiery furnace in chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar erects a golden statue 27 meters high and commands every person in the empire to bow before it. 3 young Jews refuse. They are thrown into a furnace heated 7 times beyond its normal intensity, and they survive. More than that, Nebuchadnezzar looks into the flames and sees a 4th figure walking among them. What is extraordinary is how this story ends, not with Nebuchadnezzar punished, not with him humiliated or destroyed. It ends with him marveling. It ends with him issuing a decree that no one across the entire empire may speak against the God of the Jews. The text performs a kind of theological alchemy, transforming the very man who demolished the temple into an involuntary witness to the power of the temple's God. And then there is the dream. Chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar dreams of a colossal tree so tall it pierces the sky, so broad its canopy covers the whole earth. Its fruit feeds every living thing. Birds nest in its branches. Animals rest in its shade. Then an angel descends and delivers the command: cut it down, strip its branches, scatter its fruit, but leave the stump rooted in the ground, bound with iron and bronze, exposed to the dew of heaven, its fate shared with the beasts of the field for 7 times. Daniel delivers the interpretation without flinching. The tree is you, Nebuchadnezzar. What follows is arguably the strangest passage in the entire Hebrew Bible. Nebuchadnezzar is driven out from human society. He eats grass like an ox, dew soaks his body, his hair grows long as eagle feathers, his nails curve like the claws of a bird. 7 times pass, 7 years, 7 seasons, 7 periods of exile from his own humanity, until at last he lifts his eyes toward heaven, and his reason returns, and he blesses the Most High. Historians and psychologists have proposed many explanations. Some point to clinical lycanthropy, the rare psychiatric condition in which a person genuinely believes they have become an animal. Others suggest porphyria or a severe psychotic episode. A fragmentary text discovered at Qumran, known as the Prayer of Nabonidus, describes a Babylonian king struck down by illness and removed from power, hinting that some authentic tradition may lurk beneath the narrative. But the most honest reading is probably the literary one. The author of Daniel is constructing a parable about the nature of power itself. The tree that touches the sky is the same arrogance as the Etemenanki. The king who imagines himself a god ends up grazing in a field. The man who stamped his name into every brick of the greatest city on earth is reduced to something barely recognizable as human. The message is not subtle. There is a threshold to human ambition. Cross it, and the fall is not merely political, it is ontological. You stop being human altogether. This tension between Nebuchadnezzar's undeniable greatness and the theological interpretation the Jewish writers imposed on that greatness may be the most enduring legacy of the entire exile, because the biblical authors did not minimize Babylon. They did not pretend it was weak or crude or forgettable. They looked at the golden statue, the world-spanning tree, the empire that stretched across all nations, and they acknowledged the full weight of it. Yes, it is immense. Yes, it is extraordinary. And yes, it will fall. Because everything built by human hands eventually falls. Every tower reaches its limit. Every tree that grazes the sky will one day be felled. And the stump left behind, bound with iron and bronze in the wet grass, is all that any empire finally amounts to. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, knew none of this. He had no idea that the exiles were writing. He didn't know that deported priests were sitting in mud brick houses along irrigation canals, gathering and editing texts that would outlast everything: the Babylonian Empire, the Persian, the Greek, the Roman, the medieval world, and every civilization that has risen and collapsed in the centuries since. Nebuchadnezzar believed his immortality lived in the bricks, in the walls, in the name pressed into fired clay by the tens of millions. And for 2,600 years, those bricks have crumbled, those walls have fallen. That name survives now only in museums, in fragments, in shards, small enough to hold in one hand. But the texts the exiles composed by the rivers of Babylon, those are read every single day, in every language on earth, by billions of people who have never once heard of Imgur Enlil or Nimiti Enlil, but who know Psalm 137 by heart. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept. The irony is almost unbearable. Nebuchadnezzar constructed the largest city the ancient world had ever seen, precisely so that he would be remembered forever. And he is remembered forever, but not for the bricks. He is remembered because the people he deported wrote about him. The destroyer of the temple was preserved by the people of the temple. The conqueror was immortalized by the conquered. He lives in human memory not through what he built, but through what he destroyed, and through what the survivors of that destruction made from the wreckage. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because at this point in the story, Nebuchadnezzar is still very much alive. He is still the most powerful man on earth, and the final years of his reign contain mysteries that archaeology has not yet fully resolved. Those years are, for historians, a territory of shadows, not because the inscriptions run dry, but for a different and more puzzling reason. Dozens of administrative texts survive from the late reign: ration records, commercial contracts, legal documents stamped with dates from the 35th, 38th, 40th year. The bureaucratic machinery of the empire kept running with the precision of a clock. What's conspicuously absent from the later years of his reign, however, are the grand narratives, those sweeping royal inscriptions in which Nebuchadnezzar catalogued his conquests, celebrated his constructions, and proclaimed his intimate relationship with the gods. These bombastic declarations, so characteristic of his earlier decades, practically vanish after a certain point. The last great building inscriptions date from his 30s as king, and after that, an unusual quiet settles over the record. It's a silence scholars consider deeply meaningful, even if no one can explain it with certainty. What we can say is this: Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 43 years. Sit with that number for a moment. Alexander the Great held power for 13. Julius Caesar ruled Rome for 5. Napoleon commanded Europe for 15. Nebuchadnezzar sat on the throne of the most powerful empire on earth for 43 years, which means that in 562 BC, the year he died, there were 40-year-old adults in Babylon who had never known another king. For an entire generation, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't simply a ruler, he was a fixed feature of existence, as inevitable as the seasons. The sun rose in the east, the Euphrates flowed south. Nebuchadnezzar sat on the throne. It had always been that way. It always would be that way, except it wouldn't. He died in the month of Ululu, roughly October of 562 BC. The circumstances are entirely unknown. No inscription records the moment. No surviving text mentions illness, assassination, or accident. What little we know comes from the Babylonian chronicles and later sources. He died, and his son Amel-Marduk ascended in his place. That's it. The man who built the largest city the ancient world had ever seen, who destroyed Jerusalem, who deported entire nations, who pressed his name into millions of bricks across Mesopotamia. This man exits history with a bureaucratic notation, where the records once read *year 43 of Nebuchadnezzar*, they now read *accession year of Amel-Marduk*. The machine continues, the name changes, the gear turns. But what followed Nebuchadnezzar's death matters just as much as anything he accomplished in life. Because the empire he constructed, the most formidable on earth, ringed by the greatest walls ever raised, nourished by the most fertile land on the planet, administered by a bureaucracy of almost mechanical precision, began to collapse almost immediately. Not from the outside in, from the inside out. And the speed of that disintegration is its own kind of verdict. When an empire outlives its founder, it means the institutions were strong. When it crumbles without him, it means the founder was the empire, that everything depended on one man. What held the empire together was never the walls or the temples or the vast bureaucratic machinery. It was the concentrated force of one man's will, and the moment that will was gone, everything began to give way. Amel-Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar's son, called evil Merodach in the Bible, lasted 2 years on the throne. 2. Yet even within that brief reign, Scripture preserves a small but luminous detail. In his first year as king, he released Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, who had been rotting in a Babylonian prison since his deportation in 597 BC. Amel-Marduk gave him new clothes, seated him at the royal table above all the other captive kings, and honored him for the rest of his life. In the sweep of world history, this barely registers, but for the Jewish exiles living in Babylon, it was everything. The king of David's line was alive. He was free. He was being honored inside the very court that had destroyed Jerusalem. The lineage had not been snuffed out. Hope, fragile as it was, still had a pulse. But Amel-Marduk didn't survive long enough to see what that hope would become. In 560 BC, his own brother-in-law, a general named Nebuchadnezzar, who had personally participated in the siege of Jerusalem 26 years earlier, led a palace coup and had him killed. Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 4 years. He launched a military campaign into Cilicia, in what is now southern Turkey, and then died, apparently of natural causes, in 556. His son Labashi-Marduk inherited the throne. Labashi-Marduk was a child, and children sitting atop the most powerful empire on earth tend not to last. He was dead within months, some accounts say weeks. murdered by a circle of conspirators led by a man named Nabonidus. Do the arithmetic. 6 years, 3 kings, 2 of them murdered, 1 dead, possibly of disease. Nebuchadnezzar's dynasty, the house of Nabopolassar, the lineage that had shattered Assyria and remade the ancient world, was wiped out in less time than it had taken Nebuchadnezzar to finish the eastern wall of Babylon. And then came Nabonidus, and with him Babylon's history enters its strangest chapter. Nabonidus was not royalty. He was not a military commander. He was not a priest of Marduk. His mother, Adad-Gupi, had been a devoted priestess of Sin, the moon god, in the city of Haran, far to the north in Upper Mesopotamia, and Nabonidus carried that devotion with him to the throne of Babylon, pressing it forward with a fervor that left the capital's religious establishment visibly shaken. Picture the scene from inside the Exile, the greatest temple in the ancient world. Your family has served Marduk across generations. Nebuchadnezzar poured fortunes into adorning that temple. Marduk was the reason Babylon sat at the center of the known world, the cosmic guarantor of Babylonian supremacy. And now the new king is redirecting resources toward the temples of Sin. He is elevating the moon god. He is quietly dismantling the theological order that underpinned everything. It was, in effect, a medieval pope arriving at the Vatican and declaring that Odin was the one true god. Political madness doesn't quite cover it. But Nabonidus then did something even harder to explain. After a few years on the throne, he left. He simply left Babylon. He marched an army deep into the Arabian desert, seized the oasis city of Timah in the northwest of the Arabian Peninsula, a prosperous hub along ancient trade routes, and stayed there for 10 years. The king of the most powerful empire on earth abandoned his own capital for an entire decade, leaving his son Belshazzar behind as regent and disappearing into the sands. Why? No one has ever settled the question. Theories run from open warfare with Marduk's clergy to commercial ambition to something darker, the unraveling of a mind under impossible pressure. For 10 years, the Akitu festival went uncelebrated. 10 years without the ceremony at the heart of Babylonian religious life, that sacred moment when the king clasped the hand of Marduk's statue and had his divine mandate renewed. For the Babylonians, this wasn't mere negligence or administrative oversight. It was something far more unsettling. It meant cosmic order had been suspended, that the ancient contract between the gods and humanity had quietly lapsed, and nobody had bothered to renew it. While Nabonidus wandered his desert sanctuary and Belshazzar administered a capital growing more restless by the year, a force was gathering in the east that would render all of this academic. His name was Cyrus. Cyrus II of Persia, the man history would come to call Cyrus the Great. He had started as king of Anshan, a modest kingdom tucked into southwestern Iran, and in a remarkably short span of time had accomplished what most would have considered impossible. He defeated the Medes and absorbed their empire. He swept west and conquered Lydia in Asia Minor. He pushed east to the Hindu Kush. By the late 540s, he had stitched together a dominion stretching from the Aegean to the edge of the Indian subcontinent, and now his gaze had settled on Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's city, the city of impossible walls, the last great prize the ancient world had left to offer. And here, history arrives at one of those moments that feels too convenient, too dramatic to be genuine, and yet is entirely real. In October of 539 BC, 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, the Persian army appeared before the gates of Babylon, and the gates opened. There was no prolonged siege, no desperate last stand behind those legendary fortifications, no epic resistance worthy of the walls that had inspired awe across the ancient world. The sources disagree on the finer points. The Nabonidus Chronicle records a battle at Opis on the Tigris where the Babylonian army was broken, followed by Sippar surrendering without resistance, and then Babylon itself falling without a fight. The Cyrus cylinder, that famous clay inscription Cyrus commissioned after the conquest, goes considerably further in its claims. It tells us that Marduk, Babylon's own god, had grown furious with Nabonidus for his impiety and had personally selected Cyrus as an instrument of divine correction. That Marduk searched every land for a righteous ruler, found Cyrus, and called him to govern the world. That Persian soldiers entered the city in peace, that the Babylonian people welcomed them with joy. Propaganda, certainly. The Cyrus cylinder is imperial messaging of the highest sophistication, brilliant, carefully crafted, and unmistakably self-serving. Cyrus was doing precisely what every shrewd conqueror does, framing his conquest in the religious vocabulary of the people he had just defeated, not an invasion, an invitation from Marduk himself. But beneath the polished narrative, one historical truth remains impossible to obscure. Nebuchadnezzar's walls failed, the greatest fortifications the ancient world had ever produced. Double walls, triple walls, a flooded moat, watchtowers rising every 20 meters, ramparts wide enough for 2 chariots to pass each other at full gallop. None of it saved Babylon. Not because the engineering was flawed, because everything behind those walls had already collapsed from within. A demoralized garrison, a priesthood seething with contempt for their own king, a population that had watched their most sacred festival cancelled 10 years running, an absent monarch, and a regent with no real authority. The walls were exactly what Nebuchadnezzar had built them to be. The problem is that walls don't defend cities, people do, and in October of 539, the people of Babylon had nothing left they cared to defend. What Cyrus did next matters enormously to the story unfolding here, because Cyrus was a fundamentally different kind of conqueror. Where the Assyrians deported and the Babylonians demolished, Cyrus restored. The cylinder announces the rebuilding of sanctuaries, the return of sacred statues to their temples, and the repatriation of displaced peoples to their homelands. Among those peoples were the Jews. The book of Ezra preserves the decree, Cyrus, king of Persia, declaring that the God of heaven had given him all the kingdoms of the earth, and charging him to build a house for that God in Jerusalem. Anyone among his people was free to go up and build. Ezekiel's valley of dry bones was stirring back to life. In 538 BC, less than 50 years after Jerusalem's destruction, the first waves of Jewish exiles began making their way home. Not all of them. Many stayed behind. They had been born in Babylon, built businesses there, raised children there, put down roots that stretched across generations. The Jewish community of Mesopotamia would endure for another 2.5 millennia, right up until the exodus of Iraqi Jews in 1950 and 1951. But those who did return carried something with them that their ancestors had not possessed when they were dragged away in chains. They carried the texts, the parchment scrolls that had been edited, compiled, expanded, and refined throughout the long years of exile. The revised Torah, the prophetic collections, the Psalms, the Lamentations, the literature that had kept a people spiritually alive when every surrounding circumstance insisted they should simply cease to exist. They also carried an idea that had not existed before the exile, or had existed only as a dim intuition, and that the ordeal of displacement had forged into absolute, unshakable conviction. Not the practical monolatry of pre-exilic times, the comfortable assumption that their God was the primary one while other gods occupied lesser positions in some divine hierarchy, but genuine monotheism. There is only one God. He created everything. He governs everything. The gods of the surrounding nations are wood and stone, gold and silver, the careful work of human craftsmen. They have eyes and cannot see. They have ears and cannot hear. They have mouths and cannot speak. There is only one. And this one does not inhabit a temple. He does not belong to a city or a country or a particular stretch of land. He lives in the words. He lives in the text. He lives wherever someone opens the book and reads. And here is where Nebuchadnezzar's story delivers its final devastating irony, one that no Babylonian scribe could have anticipated, and that perhaps no Jewish prophet fully grasped in the moment it was unfolding. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem to demonstrate Marduk's supremacy over the God of Israel, to prove that the local deity of an insignificant hilltop city on the empire's distant periphery was no match for the Lord of the Exile, and in doing so, he forced the Jewish people to accomplish the one thing that could transform a tribal religion into a universal faith. He compelled them to abandon the place and embrace the text. He drove them to the discovery that God required no walls, that the divine presence could inhabit a community gathered around words rather than stones, that the sacred was portable, that faith could absorb total annihilation and emerge from the wreckage not merely intact but transformed into something far more powerful. Nebuchadnezzar, in attempting to destroy the God of Israel, made that God immortal. By demolishing the small house in Jerusalem, he forced the Jews to build a house large enough to contain the entire world. His most destructive act produced the most creative consequence in the religious history of humanity. And Marduk, the god in whose name all of this was done, vanished. When the Persians absorbed Babylon, Marduk was still worshipped. When Alexander's Greeks arrived in 331 BC, the cult persisted, though weakened. Under Parthian rule, Marduk had become little more than an echo, and at some point in the early centuries of the Christian era, the last priest of Marduk performed the last ritual in the Exile, which by then was already a ruin, and a religion that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for 3,000 years simply fell silent. No drama, no persecution, no decree, just silence. The temple Nebuchadnezzar had covered in gold and lapis lazuli became a mound of earth that local Bedouin called Babel, and the God who had no temple continued to be worshipped in Jerusalem, in Rome, in Alexandria, in Babylon itself, in every synagogue, every church, every mosque on the face of the planet. But this is not only a story about gods, it is a story about what endures, about what genuinely survives when centuries roll over everything without mercy. If you could travel back to Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon at the height of its glory, walk the processional way with the glazed lions shimmering on either side, breathe in the incense drifting from the Exile, hear the hymns to Marduk reverberating between those immense walls, run your fingers across bricks engraved with the king's name, and feel the cuneiform wedges pressed into the clay, and if someone standing beside you said that all of it would disappear, you would laugh. You would say it was impossible, that those walls would stand forever, that the empire was eternal, and you would be wrong. Completely, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon did not fall the way Rome fell, leaving behind triumphal arches and colosseums and aqueducts that still stand 2,000 years later. Babylon disappeared in the most literal sense because Nebuchadnezzar's city was built from mud bricks, millions upon millions of them, sun-baked or kiln-fired, stacked and mortared with bitumen. And mud bricks, regardless of how thick the walls or how generously the bitumen was applied, do not last. Rain dissolves them, wind erodes them, the sun cracks them, their own accumulated weight eventually crushes them. Without constant maintenance, the largest brick structures ever raised by human hands slowly melt back into the earth, forming the low, shapeless hills that archaeologists call tells. Artificial mounds composed of layer upon layer of dissolved civilization. Fly over southern Iraq today and you will see dozens of them. Every gentle rise on the flat horizon is a dead city. Every subtle elevation is the remnant of a place that once had walls and markets and temples and children playing in its streets. Babylon is one of those hills. When the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey arrived at the site in 1899, he found exactly that, formless mounds rising from the Mesopotamian plain roughly 90 kilometers south of Baghdad. The locals knew something lay beneath. Ancient bricks surfaced regularly from the soil, and Bedouin traders had been looting the site for centuries, selling inscribed fragments to European collectors, but no systematic excavation had ever been attempted. Koldewey stayed for 18 years, from 1899 until World War I finally forced him to abandon the dig in 1917. He and his team unearthed the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, fragments of the city walls, and the foundations of the Great Palace. And on nearly every brick they uncovered, the same inscription appeared: Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, son of Nabopolassar, king of Babylon, stamped into the clay millions of times, a man's obsession with his own immortality repeated until it became almost absurd. There is an uncomfortable reflection buried here. Those bricks, the ones Nebuchadnezzar stamped with his name like a child carving initials into a school desk, are precisely the reason we know so much about him. They are the reason we can reconstruct his walls on paper, estimate the dimensions of his palaces, map the layout of his streets. The king's vanity is, ironically, the king's gift to posterity. Archaeologists recovered so many inscribed bricks that museums across the world are stocked with them. The British Museum holds hundreds. The Pergamon in Berlin displays the Ishtar Gate reconstructed from original bricks. Even modest university collections have their specimens. Nebuchadnezzar wanted his name to last forever, and it did, but not as a symbol of living power, as an artifact, a museum piece, an archaeological curiosity displayed behind glass for tourists who pass by glancing at their phones. Then came those who tried to reclaim Babylon's legacy, because the idea of Babylon, the most powerful city in the world, the center of civilization, the place where humanity dared to build a tower reaching toward heaven, exerts a magnetic pull on leaders who see themselves as heirs to something immense. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, and in his final months he had planned to restore it as the capital of his world empire. Had he not died at 32, he might have succeeded, but he died, and Babylon continued sinking into the earth. Centuries accumulated. The sand covered everything. The walls dissolved across 2 millennia of rain. The canals silted up. The most fertile plain in the ancient world became desert because no one remained to maintain the irrigation systems that had made it bloom. And Babylon slept until, in the 20th century, another man looked at those mounds of earth and saw something no one else was seeing. Saddam Hussein, who ruled Iraq from 1979 to 2003, gazed at the ruins of Babylon and recognized himself as the new Nebuchadnezzar. And here the story enters a cycle that would be almost comical if it were not so tragic. Saddam ordered parts of Babylon rebuilt, not restored, rebuilt. New walls rose over ancient foundations. A palace for himself was constructed on an artificial hill inside the archaeological site, positioned so that he could look down and survey the ruins like a proprietor surveying his estate. And on the new reconstruction bricks, he ordered an inscription stamped. It read, "In the reign of the victorious Saddam Hussein, President of the Republic, may God preserve him, guardian of Great Babylon, who rebuilt it in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar." He placed himself beside Nebuchadnezzar, literally on the same brick, using the same technique, animated by the same vanity. Saddam Hussein's fate reads like a parable written specifically to close this story. The man who compared himself to Nebuchadnezzar, who commissioned coins bearing both profiles side by side, who ordered documentaries celebrating the shared glory of the ancient king and the modern president. This man was toppled by an invading army, pulled from a hole in the ground, tried before a court of his own countrymen, and executed on a December morning. The palace he had built over Babylon was occupied by foreign troops during the 2003 invasion. Soldiers parked tanks among the ruins. Sandbags were filled with earth containing 3,000-year-old archaeological fragments. A military helipad was constructed beside the Temple of Nineveh, and UNESCO, appalled, worked to document the damage that the occupation had inflicted on the site. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. 2,500 years later, the spiritual heirs of Jerusalem, Western civilization born from the book that Jewish exiles wrote on the banks of the Euphrates, returned and walked across Babylon in combat boots. If that is not historical irony, then nothing is. But Nebuchadnezzar's story teaches something that reaches beyond irony. What Nebuchadnezzar built was extraordinary by every measure the ancient world understood. The largest army, the tallest walls, the grandest temples, the most efficient empire the Near East had ever seen. 43 years on the throne without a successful revolt, without a decisive defeat after Carchemish, with wealth and authority that made lesser kings tremble at the mention of his name, by the only standard that seemed to matter, the capacity to impose your will on the world. Nebuchadnezzar was among the most successful human beings who ever lived, and yet his power did not survive him. His son was murdered within 2 years. His empire collapsed within 23. His dynasty was wiped from the earth, his religion forgotten, his God reduced to a footnote, and his magnificent city, those legendary walls, those hanging gardens, dissolved slowly back into the mud from which they rose. The rain did what no army could. Meanwhile, the people he tried to erase, that small, stateless, weaponless people he dragged 500 miles into captivity, still exist. They still read the same texts. They still weep before the same wall. They still celebrate the same festivals and tell the same stories their ancestors told beside the rivers of Babylon. And not only did they survive, they gave the world the 2 largest religions in human history. Christianity and Islam are both, in their deepest roots, daughters of the theological revolution that the Babylonian exile forced into being. The catastrophe that was meant to end a people instead transformed them into something the world had never seen before. So perhaps the question this story leaves us with is not really about Nebuchadnezzar at all. Perhaps it is about us, about what we are building, about whether we are raising walls or writing words, whether we are stamping our names on bricks or shaping ideas that might outlive everything we own. Because Nebuchadnezzar's bricks sit in museum display cases and the words of his captives live in 3 billion homes. Sit with that for a moment. 3 billion people, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, live today under the direct influence of a book written in large part by stateless refugees sitting beside a foreign river, weeping with longing for a city that had been burned to ash. The psalms they composed in that grief are still sung. The prophecies they gathered are still read aloud. The stories they preserved are still taught to children who have never heard the name Nebuchadnezzar. And the worldview they articulated, a single universal God who cares about justice, who hears the cry of the oppressed, who does not dwell in palaces but in the hearts of those who seek him. That worldview shaped Western civilization, Islamic civilization, and through them the entire modern world. Nebuchadnezzar built gardens that defied gravity. The exiles planted an idea that defied time. He raised walls no army could breach. They wrote words no empire could silence. He stamped his name on millions of bricks. They placed the name of their God on every page of the most read, most translated, most influential book in the history of humanity. What this story reveals is not a fairy tale about the weak defeating the strong. It is something more unsettling than that, and truer. What it reveals is that power without meaning dissolves the moment the force behind it fails. that empires built purely on domination vanish when the domination ends, that bricks melt but words do not, that golden temples sink into the earth, while a genuine idea floats across centuries as though it weighs nothing at all. The real story of Nebuchadnezzar is not the story of a king who went mad and ate grass in a field, though that image carries its own haunting truth about the fragility of human greatness. It is not simply the story of a genius builder who raised wonders, though he undeniably did. It is not only the story of a brutal conqueror who destroyed cities and deported nations, though that too is undeniably real. The true story is what happens when a man who possesses everything, all the power, all the wealth, all the control the ancient world could offer, encounters the one thing he cannot control: an idea. A faith, a stubborn refusal to disappear no matter how many temples you burn, how many chains you forge, how many miles of desert you force a people to cross. Nebuchadnezzar won every battle he could fight with an army. He conquered every enemy he could see and touch and imprison. But he lost the only contest that history remembers: the battle against an idea that was greater than he was, greater than his empire, greater than his God. That is the echo that reaches across 2,600 years and arrives here, now, in this moment. Power builds impressive things. Only meaning builds eternal things. Nebuchadnezzar's bricks are in museums. The words of his captives are everywhere. If anyone ever needed proof that the most powerful forces in the world are not armies, not walls, not wealth, but stories, ideas, and words written by people who had nothing else left, the story of Nebuchadnezzar and his exiles is that proof, still speaking, still refusing to be silenced. I'd love to know what you think. In a world that still celebrates power above almost everything else, do you believe meaning can truly outlast it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, a like helps it reach someone else who might need to hear it. And if you want to keep exploring these ancient worlds together, subscribe. There's so much more waiting. Because some stories, it turns out, were never meant to end.